very pleased to be here as a guest of the China Writers Association and the Guangdong Provincial Writers Association. It's a real thrill because my interest in Chinese culture is growing every day. This paper, as a prefatory comment, has as its underlying question information theory, which is a mathematical theory of how messages are transmitted, which has only been with us for around about 70 years, and I don't believe that its ramifications for verbal art have been fully realised. The bulk of the paper is my subjective response to thinking about that. So, one of the central preoccupations in my work since 2011 has been thematic and technical, the question of voice in poetry. From the outset, I want to be clear that I do not mean voice in its customarily metaphorical sense of signature or style. Instead, I mean how the materiality of voice can be part of our understanding of poetry. Of course, I know that in reading words on a page, any consideration or discussion of such voice must be imaginary or figurative, as there is only the silence of paper and ink to accompany it. But I hope to avoid the kind of figurative treatment of the subject which is often the subject of creative writing workshops, which is my bread and butter. I want to start with the voice of another, in this case that of Bill Maidment, academic at the University of Sydney, and my friend and mentor from around 1991 until his death in 2005. One morning in early 2006, I had a hypnagogic hallucination. It was Bill's voice waking me, saying something to me in keeping with the nature of our friendship. I was startled. It was as if he was in the pre-door room with me, and I struggled to process what it was he said and the fact that I thought I had actually heard it and not imagined it. Several questions arose which demanded answers. These were philosophical, technical and ethical questions. There was a creative crisis engendered by Bill's death for a number of years, and by answering the questions that were raised sent me down three paths which are somewhat related. The first of these paths was a question of rhyme. In my poetic practice hitherto, considerations of sound had always been a driving creative force, and I had always considered rhyme as one of a number of poetic devices, along with assonance, alliteration, chiasmus and so on, which are ultimately variations on the principle of oral repetition. Susan Stewart claims as much for rhyme in her essay In the Sound of Poetry. Prior to 2005, I had written several rhyming poems, but acutely aware of the almost visceral disdain for rhyme on the part of several contemporary Australian poets, as well as it being a marker for a poetically reactionary political conservatism, I searched for ways to explore rhyme in more innovative ways. My encounter with the half-rhymes of the English translations of Joseph Brodsky's poems was quickly superseded by the discovery of Paul Muldoon's innovations with rhyme in terms of their slantness and their asymmetrical arrangement across a stanza and the differing lengths of rhyming lines, which ultimately derive from Louis MacNeice. After several experiments, I arrived at what I felt was an original solution, although, as with all claims to originality, I had merely belatedly echoed the achievements of others. Without access to my library while writing this paper, I can only offer the example of the American poet Liz Waldner as someone whose approach is as systematic as I've tried to be. My idea was to adopt, as a constraint, the rearrangement of the terminal phonemes of rhyming lines, which in practice involved up to 4 syllables, and which also involved the occasional inversion of phonemes. The result was what a colleague of mine called a mellifluous sonorousness, but that was merely a byproduct of a systematic derangement of the sense of a few phonemes grouped together. It looked and sounded nice, but had begun with what was a notion of fracture, that by taking apart the language in this fashion, I was in effect identifying what might be a constituent element of the voice, which we should call the phoneme, but which I would prefer to call the tympaneme. More of that later. There is an example in the paper from my poem Coastline, which I won't read out. I think you can read it yourselves. Some of the lines are evidence of what I talk about, but of course it also fails to be as systematic as I've described, because I'm not a machine, even though I'm a cybernetic organism. The second poetic path I went down after Bill's death was a fairly extensive consideration of voice. What is it? What does it mean? What are its different dimensions? Epistemological, phenomenological, poetic, political, psychic, and so on. Given the centrality, indeed the fundamental necessity of the voice to utterance, it is surprising how little has been devoted to the voice in philosophy, psychoanalysis, and even linguistics. It is as if the vehicle which enables and sustains our verbal interactions is not worthy of, or perhaps not amenable to the kind of sustained analysis that de Saussure, for example, was able to undertake with regard to the system of language. In attempting to recuperate the voice as a subject for poetry itself, I again found myself concerned with trying to understand it in its fundamental aspects, anatomising it, if you like. In so doing, I kept coming back to the idea of a voice which is a continuum of sound being reduced to its constituent elements or phonemes. Here I was reminded of Jacques Lacan's suggestion that the element that the signifying structure ultimately refers to is the phoneme which materialises the structure of language. The phoneme is the subject of the signifier, but the phoneme itself lacks sense. The signifying body or divided self disappears in the act of signification. A consideration of this aspect of the phoneme partly constitutes the second partition of my book, Anatomy of Voice, and I give a brief description of the technical aspects of it there. One key line in that section is describing other voices. Inside it, there are others tenting the dark, which I think is a version of Bakhtin's heteroglossia. I want now to move beyond technical considerations to the broader issues to do with this investigation of voice. The first relates to what a voice is from a psychoanalytic point of view. One of the first things a baby does is to cry. From a Lacanian perspective, this is clearly a recognition of and an appeal to an other. This is of profound importance to any consideration of voice in poetry, that it involves a recognition of and an appeal to the other. The second point relates to how the voice appeals to the other, through hearing. One could argue that the most significant development in modern poetry took place in the early Jurassic, around 195 million years ago, with the appearance of Hadrocodium, a small mammalia form, now extinct, around 3.2 centimetres long and possessing a nearly full mammalian ear. One cannot speculate how the evolution of mammals, let alone humans, might have occurred without the faculty of hearing, but it is certain that poetry would not exist without it. The assumption that poems were first sung, accompanied or not by music, has been challenged by Derrida. His argument that writing precedes speech has its analogue in the supposed precedence of voice to hearing. Did the ear develop in response to the call of the voice, or did voice arise at the invitation of the ear? Or, following the French critic Roger Caillois, do we see the voice as not having a utility bestowed upon it through natural selection, but rather as a mode or part of a mode of appearing in the world? A third aspect of voice emerges when we consider that the theory of evolution might have failed us and we might need myth to step in. In Greek mythology, there is an intimate connection between listening, hearing, and death. To hear the song of the siren is to be lured to one's death. To listen to the riddle of the siren's distant cousin, the Sphinx, and not to solve it is to die. Death arrives in the manner of the poison Claudius pours in old Hamlet's ear, with hearing. And hearing is nothing more than the inscription on the basilar membrane of the inner ear by way of the mechanical operation of the auditory ossicles, which are set off by vibrations of the tympanum, a form of writing of which the fundamental unit may be termed the tympaneme. Writing has long been understood in terms of death and corruption, as Derrida has noted, but there is another way of looking at this connection between inscriptive hearing and death, and that is through information theory. The thermodynamics of information copying dictates that there must be a trade-off between precision and energy. The imprecision of informational replication at the biological level may lead to cancer if one is unlucky, but certainly leads to senescence and death. The imprecision of informational replication in the ear should be closely associated in myth with death, seems from this point of view to be more than an apt analogy. Having arrived at this point, I must confess that my understanding of information theory is limited, like most of us I suspect, by any detailed understanding of its mathematics. Perhaps for this reason, the application of information theory to literary studies has been notoriously sterile. Not the least reason for this is that the information of a literary text subjected to information theoretical analysis tends to be based on the mathematical understanding of a text consisting of binary values assigned to words or letters. This extends from computational literary studies, as practiced by a colleague of mine at the University of Newcastle, to the use of certain mathematical techniques in Neil Rubin-King's program Brickdown, which has been utilised by the Australian poet John Tranter in several of his compositions since the late 1980s. In the case of Tranter, he ostensibly seeks to create a writer-free literary text, a text free of authorial intentions and without buried cultural, social, economic and political values and hidden personality agendas, giving forth only literature in its pure state. I am not sure such purity is at all possible, even if Tranter means it ironically, for both Rubin-King's program and my colleagues' researchers are also voice-free. But if the unit of information subjected to such information theoretical techniques was the tympaneme, would the result differ? In one sense, no. Probabilistic analysis would still apply. But in another sense, the answer is most assuredly yes, for the imprecision would firstly be a much greater factor, as would the redundancy of the voice itself and any ambient noise captured in its encoding. This is precisely what I've done in my experiments with the speech recognition software that was once native to Microsoft Word 2005, which is the third and least significant strand of my poetic responses to researching voice. There is much I could say about these experiments, but I do not have the time here. I hope to offer some examples in my reading tonight. Perhaps, as Jacques Attali has noted, changes in music function as a harbinger of cultural changes, and the most we might say of these experiments is that they were prefigured by the lo-fi pop and rock recording movement of the 1990s. I'd like to conclude with some more speculation, drawing on what I have already put before you, with some suggestions, purely from my point of view, for ways forward. We do not hear perfectly. To do so is impossible, for there is energy in the message lost through the act of oral transcription. Similarly, and this ramifies, I think, beyond the immediate context, forgetting requires energy and is also, therefore, imperfect. Yet our literary institutions have their foundations in a scholarly precision which in the West is founded on the scientific method. We are anxious to preserve texts and certain meanings, yet we are uncomfortable perhaps with the connection between the logarithmic measure of uncertainty, which is the amount of information a message contains, and the relative certainty of meaning, which is more or less the elimination of uncertainty. Another way of thinking of this connection is as order from confusion sprung, such gaudy tulips raised from dung, where it is through our propensity to mishear, to misapprehend, and to selectively listen to the messages we receive that important possible paths forward are opened to us. And let me stress, I am not talking about fake news here or willful ignorance of climate science. I'm restricting my comments to poetry. Contrary to what we would expect from classic information theory, the human brain's ability to correctly hear and interpret an interrupted message is easier in a crowded or noisy environment than it is when an interrupted utterance is listened to in isolation where silence fills the gaps. This is what researcher Albert Bregman calls auditory scene analysis, and it has, I think, implications for our thinking of the voice in poetry. What if the apparent chaos of noise, mishearing, and so on were not only natural but conducive to the production of new meanings? And rather than exclusively finding in systems and coherences abstract aporias and disjunction, what if a source of these was also voice itself, its timbres, intonations, stresses and sonorities, as well as its ambience, resonances, and perhaps even more importantly, pluralities? The redundancies in the speaking voice signal an enriched understanding of intelligible meaning, as they perhaps do in Jerome Rothenberg's translations, but they might also signal a revival, perhaps, of interest in rhyme in all its varied forms and its near relation rhythm. To do so would be yet another way to return to the body and the divided self, perhaps in a way that unfolds the signifying intention in an auditory scene and which invites exploration through poetry. Thank you.